and welcome back to Friends in Faith this week. Today we're going to continue our study on Jacques Philippe's book, Searching for and Maintaining Peace. Today we're going to talk about the battle for peace in our hearts, in our souls, and in our lives. But before we dive into that, I want to just refresh what we talked about last week. A very important analogy that we discussed was the analogy of still water, a clear lake that can reflect the things around it. So if you recall this image of a lake, when you see a mountain next to it or the sun above it, if that pool of water is still and calm, the mountain will be reflected almost perfectly, like a mirror. But imagine now the water becoming agitated or ripples flowing through it. All of a sudden, the image of the mountain or the sun becomes very distorted. So this is very similar to our souls in the spiritual life, right? That if God is the sun or if God is the mountain and we are that pool of water, we want to maintain that calm, still interior life so that God's grace can be reflected through us. The extent to which we maintain our interior peace is the extent to which God's grace can act in us most efficiently and effectively to the people around us and in our own lives. So holding this as a core truth for our study, then it makes all the more sense that when we are under spiritual attack, that one of the very first things and most important things that Satan is going to try to attack is our peace. When we're fighting our own spiritual battles, we might be tempted to think that the battle is to avoid sin, to not fall into temptation. And of course, this is a good thing to strive for. But the point that Jacques Philippe makes in his book for this week's study is that when we focus on avoiding temptation or avoiding sin, we're fighting a losing battle. God expects that we're going to sin. He knows us very well, and he knows that we have our own human weakness and frailty. So when we're focused so microscopically on trying not to sin, we end up holding onto our lives very tightly instead of surrendering our lives to God. And the fight against sin becomes very difficult for us. And most often in those circumstances, we're going to end up failing. Instead, expect that we fail and focus and shift our focus in the spiritual life on maintaining our peace or recovering our peace quickly after we do fall. So just take a moment here to think about how it is that you react whenever you fall. The last time that you sinned, or maybe when you undergo a frequent struggle, maybe it's with a family member, or maybe it's an addictive sin or a spiritual habit that you have that you wish that you didn't have. What happens when you fail? And what happens especially when you failed before and you told yourself last time that you weren't going to do it again, or you were going to be better this time, or you were going to avoid temptation in that near occasion of sin? Do you get angry with yourself? Do you get angry with the people around you? Do you get angry with God for allowing those things in your life? Rather, instead of letting yourself become agitated and having anger enter into you, or having despair, or becoming upset with yourself and turning in on yourself, instead of letting those things happen in your life, why not consider that God already expected that to happen, and instead the first thing that you should do is run to his loving arms and to recover your peace. Because whenever we have anger enter in, or self-hatred or judgment or any of those things, we start to see those undulations on the water of that lake of our interior souls, and God's grace is reflected less perfectly. So go back to him and recover your peace. Jacques Philippe states this very well, and I'm going to read an excerpt from the book here for you. He says, "Very frequently, spiritual combat consists precisely in this: defending one's peace of heart against the enemy who attempts to steal it from us. In effect, one of the most common strategies of the devil in his efforts to distance us from God and to slow our spiritual progress is to attempt to cause the loss of our interior peace. The first goal of spiritual combat, that toward which our efforts must above all be directed, is not to always obtain a victory over our temptations or our weaknesses, etc. Rather, it is to learn to maintain peace of heart under all circumstances, even in the case of defeat. It is only in this way that we can pursue the other goal, which is the elimination of our failures, our faults, and our imperfections and sins." I want to share with you a time in my life when I had the wrong focus in my spiritual battles. I struggled with a sin called scrupulosity, or scruples. It's kind of a spiritual mindset that focuses so intently on doing the right thing that you become really anxious about doing the right thing all the time. And it becomes very difficult when you fail, inevitably. And I found myself, I got to a point where I was going to confession every single day for things that I thought were so intense and that had severed my soul from the grace of God. And it wasn't until the Lord actually came to me and challenged my thought process that I started to embrace mercy and actually encounter this experience of God meeting me in my sin. And I experienced a great release from very chronic anxiety in my life. God looked at me and said, every time you sin, it doesn't surprise me. Every time you sin, I expected you to do this. I saw throughout all of time what you were going to do, and it doesn't make me love you less. So I just want to leave that as a note of encouragement for you, that whenever we fight, we don't fight alone, that the victory is already won for us, that God already has seen everything that we have done and will ever do in our lives, and it could not make him love us any more or any less, because God is a God of mercy, and he's always there to embrace us. So I want to leave on that note and just invite you to go ahead and reflect on this question. What happens to my peace?